Thank you very much for the kind invitation to join this panel and to share my thoughts on the topic of rights of peasants and rural people in food security, food sovereignty to tackle multi-dimensional problems. I will share my insights from the perspective of the right to development. And considering the audience that we have today, let me begin by sharing my experiences working with farmer communities in Latin America. What I have noticed is that there is a huge sense of misunderstanding when it comes to the concept of right to development. I often hear a lot of farming communities asking me, why are you talking about the right to development? Don't we have the right not to develop? And I think this comes from a general historical perspective in Latin America, where development is often associated with economic growth and rampant industrialization that has often had severe impacts on the farming community and rural people. As it is, however, the normative framework of the right to development actually rejects an understanding of development measured only in economic terms. And I want to read to you the description of the term development as we find in the 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development. It says, development is a comprehensive economic, social, and cultural and political process which aims at the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population and all individuals on the basis of their active, free, and meaningful participation in development and in the fair distribution of benefits resulting therefrom. So development here is measured in terms of well-being. That's how it is understood in the context of the right to development. It explicitly, in fact, rejects the idea of measuring development in terms of econometric values such as GDP or GDP per capita. So in that sense, I think the right to development can play a very important role in protecting and guaranteeing the rights of peasants and rural people. Now, the right to development itself is defined as an inalienable human right of all individuals and peoples, by virtue of which they are entitled to three guarantees: the right to participate in, the right to contribute to, and the right to enjoy their own development, which essentially means that the authors of what development is are the rights holders. It's they who decide. It's the peasants, it's the rural community that decides what development means to them in their own context. It's not the state, it's not the international community. The right to development is also often referred to as a right to self-determined development. And I think for rural people in particular, the idea of self-determination or self-determined development is quite central and has a deep impact on food sovereignty and food security. If you take a look at Article 1 of the ICCPR and the ICESCR, where the right to self-determination is defined, it in fact says that in no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. And clearly this has importance for food security and self-determined food systems. From a right to development perspective, and in the context of our discussion today, the ability of peasants and rural people to determine their own food systems is integral to what they understand as their own development, because this helps them define their own policies, food and agricultural systems, in order to produce healthy and culturally appropriate food according to their needs and customs. And I would say, indeed, food sovereignty is central to their economic, social, and cultural development. Food sovereignty is clearly at the heart of rural economies. But food also builds societies and social capital. Food is also culture. And the UN DROP clearly recognizes this. The normative framework of the right to development guarantees the rights to peasants and rural people, including farmers, to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy self-determined development. Now, in this context, participation is indispensable for ensuring food sovereignty. But participation must not be a mere formality. It must be active, free, and meaningful participation that enables peoples and communities, especially organized peasants, rural workers, and indigenous peoples working in the rural areas, to have a significant say in major decisions that affect their food security and sovereignty. Participation is also crucial for governments to correctly identify the obstacles to the development of peasants and rural people. Now, we do not really have to go too far to see the importance of participation in this regard, and I'd like to give you the illustration from my own country, India. As you may recall, a few years ago, the government of India, the parliament, adopted some farm laws. They modified and amended farm laws, arguably good laws. I mean, my own legal analysis was not as critical of the farm laws amendments as some others were. However, you would have seen that for 2 years, farmers in the northern belt of India went on a protest. They blocked highways, nothing came in, nothing went out, and that was a terrible disaster in terms of the trade. However, at the end of those protests, towards the end of those protests, the head of the state came on the national television, apologized to the nation, withdrew the law, and said, "We failed to consult." This is a classic example of how participation is important for food security and food sovereignty, especially of rural people and farmers whose livelihoods can often be dependent on such policies. Now, there are a number of pressures on peasants in respect of food sovereignty, big agribusiness, and an enabling environment for such agribusiness that can be nurtured and promoted by states is an existential threat to livelihoods and sovereignty. Same, I would say, goes for businesses, giant businesses that promote GMOs. But we won't really understand the obstacle to food sovereignty today if we only focus on the national dimensions. And in this context, the role of international financial institutions is very important to look at. In our own work within the expert mechanism on the right to development, we have seen and heard often from stakeholders about the conditionalities imposed by the IMF or the World Bank on loans given to poor countries, which are reliant to a large extent on the farming sector. And some of these conditionalities can include elimination of subsidies to farmers, high interest rates for domestic borrowing from domestic banks for farmers, coupled with elimination of tariffs. And the impacts of this are very severe. You often find farming communities, with their produce right in front of supermarkets, which have cheap subsidized food from the outside, competing with locally produced food. And such policies of international financial institutions can be very, very detrimental to the livelihoods. And these are then coupled with other measures such as devaluation of currency, cutting spending on social welfare such as health and education, which only adds to the overall burden. Let me turn to the World Trade Organization. WTO negotiations must take into account the rights of peasants and rural people, especially since they don't have a direct voice in the negotiations. There are significant concerns about discussions around agriculture trade liberalization, including pressures from developed countries on developing countries to eliminate their subsidies while continuing to give domestic and export subsidies to their own farmers. There are also pressures to eliminate stockpiling of food grains by developing countries to cater to times of drought. And in my own work, in my own book on multilateral trade and human rights, I had suggested that the only way to ensure that the rights of peasants are not violated is to conduct human rights impact assessments before and after trade policies, particularly agricultural trade policies are adopted. However, we do know that there is a lot of reluctance, both from developed countries but also institutionally within the WTO, to mainstream human rights impact assessments, and that definitely needs to change. Finally, international development cooperation practices often also undermine the right to development. For instance, official development assistance and humanitarian aid providers often insist on procurement of grain or agriculture produce from their own farmers rather than procure them locally from the recipient country. So, ladies and gentlemen, we need to tackle obstacles to food security and sovereignty both at the national and international levels. And I contend that the normative framework of the right to development can be a very potent ally in protecting the rights of peasants and rural peoples. Thank you.